Welcome to the 38th episode of Speaking of Poetry. I am Rennie McQuilkin, Poet Laureate of Connecticut and Simsbury. I am delighted to present bi-monthly SCTV readings by some of the area's finest poets, in conjunction with producer Ken Picard, whose artwork hangs behind me and whose pottery is in front of me. Today, I am very pleased to be joined by Edwina Trentham. She comes to us by way of Bermuda, where she spent much of her youth, and Asnuntuck Community College in Enfield, Connecticut, where she taught for many years and where she edited an outstanding literary journal, Freshwater. She has also been a visiting instructor in the Graduate Liberal Studies program at Wesleyan University. Having recently retired from teaching, she now offers remarkable workshops at her home in Moodus, Connecticut, and at the Clinton Art Gallery in Clinton, Connecticut. Edwina has had a distinguished career as a poet. She is the author of Stumbling into the Light and has been a fellow at Yaddo. Her work has appeared in several anthologies and many of the country's finest journals, including the American Scholar, the Massachusetts Review, the New Virginia Review, and Prairie Schooner. She is married to Greg Coleman, a labyrinth designer, poet, and Tai Chi instructor. Welcome to Speaking of Poetry, Edwina Trentham.
Thank you, Rennie. And thank you for everything you do for poetry in Connecticut and for me personally, because I don't think I'll ever forget that moment when you asked to look at a chapbook and I came to your lovely house and you looked at it and you said to me, you know, I think we should do a full-length book.
Indeed.
And thank you.
Yes,
really.
my pleasure.
I'm very happy to be here to read from, first of all, from my book, Stumbling into the Light, and also from a manuscript that I'm working on called Learning to Lie in Her Sleep, a considerably darker one. It's May, and May is the anniversary of the death of both my father and my mother, who died 40 years apart. My father died when I was 22, and my mother died when I was 62. So I'm going to read some poems about both of them from Stumbling into the Light. I'm going to start with a poem called My Father's Heart, which is a sestina, and it's pretty self-explanatory. It's one of those poems I really don't think I need to talk about a lot. My Father's Heart. I was 7, I think, when the carving knife's thin blade sliced my finger through the dish towel, sliced right to the bone, it seemed, as I watched the white cloth turn crimson, tasted a rush of bile, choked on my breath at the sweet, sticky smell of blood, then whimpered once, like a scampering puppy who skids and catches its foot in a slammed door. I raised my hand to catch my mother's eye, but I was not surprised the thin knife had found my finger. I knew better. Or once I saw that eager blade, I did. So she was right to be furious, to glare and suck in her breath, to twist the towel tight to staunch the blood, then turn me roughly, hustle me, with one impatient turn back to snap the light off, rush me outside to catch a cab, whistle it down, stare ahead, me breathing hard against tears, she smoking, lecturing, voice thin with anger. But all that vanished the next day, right after breakfast, when my father, home just this once because of a snowstorm, took me sledding, the one and only time he did. And when I tried to turn the sled, held the rope too hard, cried out, he was right there, saw my blue mitten leaking red, and caught me in his arms to run me home. Oh, his long, thin legs plowing us through the heavy snow, his quick breath coming in smoky puffs in the clear air, his breath echoing the sound of his strong heart thumping once he hit his stride, and oh, my head against his thin chest, bumping in time to his footsteps. When I turn to this memory, that's where I choose to stay, caught up in those few moments, the way my ear was right against his beating heart, how he carried me right home through the snow in his arms. I catch my breath at this point. The truth is, details have never caught up with longing in this story. I thought just once I'd like to see what happened next, see how it turned out. But I won't shape memory to fit some thin version of truth, wrest one right story from scatters of desire. Thin stuff, when I can just turn back, find myself caught up, held still in love's sweet breath. The next one I'm going to read is called My Father's Gift. My father was a scholar, and he passed that on to me. He was a Latin and Greek scholar and had got what they call a first in greats at Oxford. So there's a couple of words in here. Oh, I guess just the unseen, which is basically a piece of Latin that you are given that you don't know, you've never seen before, and then you translate it into English. And this is about a summer of being tutored by my father. My father's gift. Hearing of my failure, my father turned his face from death for the moment, and we spent my 16th summer enclosed in screen and limestone, a porch high above the harbor, where he taught me to take apart those solid blocks of Latin that scholars love to call the unseen. Head bent to the book, long fingers resting on the uneasy card table, he returned to his Oxford days, the blithe young scholar, 50 years gone by then, handed me the keys to those blank walls of words, and we passed through them together. And so, as the sun skipped coins of light on the sea below, and oleander drifted pink and white in the corner of my eye, I learned to love the unseen. I have lost all my Latin now, but this morning, when I opened his Christ Church notebook, I found again what he gave me that summer, set down in cramped filigree, 30 years and more before my birth. The life of the mind, exuberant, contained, still blossoming on the faded page. And then there was my mother. My father was my loving parent. My mother had a little bit of trouble with love. She was, I think, threatened by her children. She did her best. I'm going to read a poem called My Mother and the Baby's Breath. Doomed by my mother's musings, the lanky gypsophila droops over her pansies, choking off the light with a net of tiny buds. For 10 days, I fight for it. Wait until it blooms, I plead, then decide. But she's not listening. So one morning, meek under her direction, I take the shovel, and while she pulls, begin to dig out the sprawling plant. Its roots are huge, like little yams, like early sweet potatoes, and it puts up a great fight. But soon she stands triumphant in the pale June sun, waving the baby's breath aloft, its frothy veil spilling around her head, while all around her feet, velvet pansies and leggy petunias raise their faces to the light. She's right, of course. She always is about gardening. The secret she teaches me over and over is brutality. Cutting out the weak, no matter how beautiful. Pinching back now if you want opulence later. One of the last poems in this book is called Flesh, and it's about my mother's last conversation with me on the phone. I was in Connecticut and she was in British Columbia where she lived. And she was in a nursing home where she was very unhappy. And I knew she wouldn't last very long when she got there. And we had come to an understanding by then, my mother and me. I had realized after a long time that I had known she was not capable of love, but I always thought I was the exception because I had been such a good little girl. And then one night, when I was, I think, in my 50s, I realized I was not the exception. She really was not capable of love, and it wasn't personal. And after that, I was able to love her and accept her. So this poem is about the last time we spoke to each other. Good night, my darling little baby, she croons just before hanging up the phone. I stare into the 3,000 miles between this room and the nursing home bed where she lies trapped. Her once perfect legs a mass of red and black bruises, strapped tight with sticky tape that will tear her paper skin off in bloody strips if she lets herself live long enough for a change of dressing. I have long known her fierce need to be the only beloved, but just for a moment, I let myself believe in that murmur, let myself return to the sweet, milky darkness of flesh on flesh, before she marked me other, before she saw me as threat. The manuscript I'm working on now, and have been revising for quite a while and keep on revising, is called Learning to Lie in Her Sleep. It's also about love in all its complexity, which my first book is about. My first book is about family love and all its sorrows and griefs and joys. My second book is about relationships outside the family. It's divided into 4 parts. The first part is about my best friend, Dinah, who was, I think, the first person I truly, truly loved outside my family. And the second part is about my really terrible first marriage. And the third part is about a very bad relationship I had with someone my friends called Mr. Crazy. They were right. And the fourth part is the happy ending. It's about my husband, Greg, whom I met when I was 51, and we've been together for 24 years. So I'm going to read first a poem that opens the second book. It touches on the first 3 sections, the one about Dinah, and the one about my first husband, and the one about Mr. Crazy. 3 takes on Moonlight. 1. Regret is a town of narrow, moonless streets where we tap door to door, trying to undo what we wish we had never begun. That blue door leads to the living room where we are 13, best friends, singing for your father, watching his glass of rum sloshing back and forth in time. Down the hill, in the moon garden, I am 21, kissing the man who will abandon you to marry me, while behind your bedroom door, you plan your own disastrous marriage. Your face, my face, are Gombe masks, dark eye holes, whistles, peacock feathers, frayed tassels, bells above our wide, perfectly carved smiles. 2. She is tired of blaming him, tired of that moonsick house in her mind, where she keeps finding him waiting to pare her down to a helpless girl. The truth is, no one gets wounded without learning how to wound, and she brought her own survival tools with her. Face it, like most of us, she married the worst parts of both her parents. And he He was just a man who knew he needed too much and figured out how to get it. 3. The half moon tonight is a slice of ripe mango, hanging low and deep gold over Pickerel Lake. It's early November, but this heavy curve of color reminds me of summer, and I keep coming face to face with Mr. Crazy, who's leaning on a moonlit wall, black curls streaked silver, wondering loudly how I could have been such a bitch that time he asked me could we stop for the Times on the way to the ER, and I said, heart attack or Times, you choose. And sure, the other times were heartburn too, but hey, have I heard about the latest? The one that shut his mouth for good this year? This first poem after the introductory one is about my friend Dinah, who grew up also in an alcoholic family. While your mother was sleeping, the last time I slept over and we crept, still children, seeking cookies, you flipped on the kitchen light and laughed as usual because all we saw was scatter, scuttle, floor, counters, walls, ceiling, sink, all alive at the harsh flooding, a scampering, wild for cover. You pointed at the elder, King Roach, thumb fat, long as my forefinger, who paced slowly, quivering antennae seeking the spill of simple syrup, key ingredient for your father's famous rum swizzle. The smeared plates, sticky glasses, left by those fleeing the brightness. Then, bare feet firm on the stained linoleum, you thrust one hand in a dark cupboard, and I saw for the first time why nothing scared you. Saw you staring your father down when he caught you lying. Saw how you could hold that hot gaze, blank your eyes longer than he could. What I saw in that kitchen was everything you'd never said. There was nothing anyone could do to you that he hadn't already done. This next poem is about my first husband. I married him when I was 21 and he was 31. He had been married before. He had 3 children, and it was a hard marriage. He was an alcoholic, and I learned a lot. He left when my son was a year old, and then I went back for another 5 years when my son was 10, which was a terrible mistake, and then I left. And in the years after we were together, during the time we were separated, and then after I left, I wrote a lot of poems about how terrible he was, because I was, after all, the innocent, this young woman who had married an older man who was an alcoholic, and all that. But the truth is, we're all responsible, and there are always 2 sides. And so I started looking, after he died 2 years ago, I started looking closely at my part in that marriage. And I wrote a series of poems that took responsibility. This one is one that's coming out in Calyx this month, and it's about forgiveness. Blessing. When she was finally able to free herself, she began to transform him. Troll clawing at her ankles from underneath the bridge. Twist of spine hanging from a bell rope. Sly dwarf, mad for her firstborn. But oh, when she heard he'd died, she caressed the bones of his face smooth, firmed his shoulders, uncurled his back, and hauled him out of the rank ditch, spider-scuttled tower, let herself speak the nickname they'd shared. Allowed him those green eyes, rolled his shirt sleeves to show arms dusted golden, recalled the half smile she'd fallen for at 17, blessed the sheltering monsters who had kept her from going back. So then, of course, I moved on to Mr. Crazy right after my first husband left me. And this is a short poem that pretty much captures the kind of relationship we had. I kept a journal, of course, for years, and he found my journals and read them, told me he'd read them, and he made remarks in them, too. So this is about a time when I didn't know that he had read my journals. And you'll notice in many of these poems I write as she because it gives me some distance so I can perhaps be a little more honest and also see things the way they were and also change things. She corrects her past. She was not true to him all those years before they met. So each time he reads her journals, he marks the names of friends she's mentioned, then rips the page corners. At night, in the mansion he bought her to thank her for coming back, the cold air clouds with their breath, and he lies hard to the wall until she's on the far edge of dreams, then eases over, breathes deep in her ear's whorled shell, his hollows spooning her bones. Did you ever? New name each night. And even though each time she sighs, never, he knows it's because she has learned how to lie in her sleep. So we're going to get cheerful now, as I always say when I start reading poems about Greg, because after all, this was a true blessing to meet Greg when I was 51, and it's a really, really good marriage. And as an example of that, and Rennie asked me if I was going to read this one because it is, as he said, a signature poem about Greg. And yes, and it is a poem, it's the first poem, I always say, I wrote it when I was about 52, and it's the first love poem I ever wrote that didn't take a shot at the guy in the last line. Today, I am one of those women. The ones I used to see walking with their lovers on city streets, and I would turn away, feel myself go pale with longing, cool with the envy I could not allow. And I would fold myself back inside like the moss rose late on summer afternoons, who pulls the pink and yellow shells of her petals tight when the sun turns into shadows. A friend once told me how she pinched them free, those folded flowers, the first time she came upon them, thought them dead, didn't know, she said, that they were only waiting for the sun to find them again, for morning to spill its warm light, draw them out, caress them into blossom. Today, I am one of those women I used to watch, the ones whose lips are always full, swollen with kissing, the ones who curve their shoulders like shells so they can link their hands, clasp them tight around their lover's arms, the ones who walk with their heads thrown back in throaty laughter, the ones whose faces are always turned into the sun. I'm going to end with a very recent poem that I wrote about my father, given that it's May and it's that anniversary, which actually was yesterday. And I wrote this in a workshop that I gave at the Clinton Art Gallery recently. And I had read online about lemongrass. Somebody told me to read about lemongrass, and the description was that you could use lemongrass to relieve despair. Instructions for the use of lemongrass oil to relieve despair. Hold your hands like cups and place one drop in one palm, letting the oil pool in the creases where your lifeline makes a V with your headline. Rub your hands together. Inhale the scent for 30 seconds. breathing in longer as desired. Such a heavy weight for one little drop of oil, to snatch that cloak drenched in darkness, sling it up, hang it from the branch of a tree, wait for the wind to catch it, dance it, snap it into and out of the light shivering down through the leaves. I think of my father, drunk on despair all his life. Try to imagine pressing his hand half closed, gently spilling that one drop into his palm, watching his hands brush slowly together, seeing him breathe, his spirit rising to skies blue as Scylla in early spring, when it first blooms along the roadside, turning new green to rivers bright as heaven. Thank you.
Thank you, Edwina. That was a lovely, lovely reading. Thank you for bringing your parents back to life and your great love for your father and your learned and final love for your mother. And after the harrowing story of the first bad husband and the crazy husband, the wonderful love that you now have with Greg Coleman, and your story of opening like a moss rose, and I think you have rubbed lemongrass into the V of our hands between the lifeline and that wonderful word, the headline, right in there. We feel much the richer for your reading. Thank you for that. And thanks to Karen Handville, the enormously talented station manager of SCTV, and to Ken Picard, who produces and edits this show and whose artwork graces its set before and behind me. And if you would like to learn more about Edwina Trentham's poetry and read samples from her book, please visit the Antrim House website, antrimhousebooks.com, where you may also be interested in other Antrim House poets whose lives and works are described on the website. Goodbye until we meet again next month for the 39th installment of Speaking of Poetry.